But if you are protein limited, it limits the amount of forage the cattle can consume. It limits the amount of forages that actually digested. It reduces the passage rate in the rumen.
Well, whether you're battling drought or your pastures are simply maturing, maybe both throughout this summer, declining forage quality can quietly rob our cattle's performance. Now, this week, Oklahoma State University Dr. David Lalman explains how to recognize when protein becomes the limiting factor and why, with today's cattle market, supplementation may be one of the best returns on your investment.
We're spending 20 cents and we're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.20, give or take, value. So tremendous return on investment there.
We'll look at when protein supplementation makes sense, which classes of cattle benefit the most, and how to determine whether the economics work for your operation. That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. It's a business discussion today as we talk about the economics of adding protein to the diets of our livestock out there. Hi, everyone. Justin Mills here, host of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Good to have you with us on our program here today. A lot in store for you in our discussion. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but just a quick reminder, if you do want to get a hold of me, maybe you have an idea for a show topic or anything like that, you can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. And of course, you can find all of our shows at workingranchradio.com. That's our site, but I know for a lot of folks, if you miss it here on the radio and you want to catch it on a podcast, or maybe that's how you listen to it normally, you can find all of our shows by going to your favorite podcast provider. Now, I might also mention, if you have missed the last few episodes, I encourage you to go back and listen to them. Last week, we were talking with Jared Wareham and Chelsea Good, a great discussion on the Mexican screwworm and its effect in the cattle industry, not just for us here domestically, but also globally. There are going to be some things that come out of this, both good, bad, and ugly, that we haven't really thought about. So great discussion about that. Also, the week ahead of that, we were with Bailey Blue from Superior Livestock as we were recapping the Corn Belt Classic. And I know it's been several weeks down the road and the market continues to roll, but it definitely set the trend for what we're seeing in this cattle market, and a great discussion to go back and listen to that, especially as you begin to plan out your marketing strategy for this upcoming year. Just wanted to mention the summer issue of Working Ranch Magazine is out. And for those of you that are regular subscribers, I know you're thoroughly enjoying the latest issue that is out there. And by the way, if you don't have a subscription, you can get started by going to workingranchmag.com, or you can also stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick one up off the shelf. They probably even have some back issues as well that you can pick up there. But a shout out here today to the Tractor Supply store in Decatur, Alabama, in Delaware, Ohio, in Delta, Colorado, and in Dilworth, Minnesota. Don't forget, later on in the show, meteorologist Don Day will be in as we continue to look at our long-range weather. Are we going to see some moisture along with this excessive heat that we've been seeing? Well, stay tuned later on in the show as we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day. Well, let's get into our show here today. And joining us on the program is Dr. David Lalman. He is a professor at Oklahoma State University. And Dr. Lalman, good to have you here today on the program.
Well, thank you. It's good to visit with you.
Well, we're talking on a topic here today that, as you and I were visiting a little bit before we started here today, I had mentioned that we see about 75% of the country in some sort of a drought situation, one or another, maybe more extreme in some places than others. But it also brings into mind, regardless of a drought situation, when we start to tail into the summer months and latter summer months, even in areas that have had adequate moisture, some of the protein requirements or protein availability that we're seeing in our pastures starts to dwindle a little bit. And it's something really, from a management standpoint, we really need to understand, don't we?
It is. There are quite a few situations. Not everybody's grazing management system and forage species they have result in a protein deficiency in the mid to late summer, but there are quite a few cattle operations around the country that would have a system and forage species that might lead to a protein deficiency, and that can have substantial impacts on cattle performance. If protein is the first limiting nutrient, it doesn't matter how much forage is available. It probably doesn't matter the quality of the forage. Well, at least it wouldn't matter as much. But if you are protein limited, it limits the amount of forage the cattle can consume. It limits the amount of forages that actually digested. It reduces the passage rate in the rumen. And therefore, at the end of the day, the animal's just able to mine less of the nutrients that are available in that forage. And so, yeah, I think it's something for every producer to just evaluate their system, think about it, and make sure that, their mid to late summer grazing system doesn't limit performance.
And I know when we were talking, some of this there's some very regional things that are specific to certain areas of the country, and you have to understand that. One of the things you talked about was, as we look at this, as we start to see the forage quality maybe not be there as we saw earlier in the year. From a management perspective, what are some things that you feel we as ranchers need to be watching? For example, as you and I were talking, I said, well, we're still seeing the manure in our cattle, even though it's been pretty dry, short grass, still staying pretty consistent or not stacking up. So those are some things I'm watching. But what else from a producer standpoint besides that what are some other things from a management standpoint we should or could be doing?
Well, I think that would be the first thing that come to mind is the manure texture, if you will, is going to tell you a lot about certainly their protein status. If the cattle are really deficient in a major nutrient like protein, gradually they'll begin to have a rougher hair coat, a little more, of a brown tinge to it. Now, that's probably not going to show up within the first month, but eventually, yeah, you'll begin to see the cattle just don't have that bloom and slick hair coat that they would have had if they were maximum forage intake and digestibility, gaining 2 pounds a day.
It's interesting there, just some of the physical components of it. And as you were talking about that, by the time we see that lack of bloom, it's not that we can't make some ground up, but it's going to be a little bit tougher, and kind of anticipating that and knowing what to be looking ahead and watching for ahead of that is probably something we need to be considering as well.
And that goes back to what you said early on, and that is producers need to understand their forage, the physiology of their forage, and I guess we'll say historical seasonal patterns. So, for example, here in Oklahoma, two dramatically different species and grazing systems we have would be, our native, say, tallgrass prairie rangelands, which that's going to be primarily big blue stem, little blue stem, some switchgrass, and some Indian grass. It is going to decline very rapidly in protein concentration. It'll be a high of somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to maybe 15, 16% maximum in early May. And then it will decline through the year down to, years like this when, especially in drought conditions, it may get down to 3 or 4% by, let's say, mid-October, 1st of November. And so that's a pretty dramatic decline. Now, Bermuda grass, on the other hand, assuming it has adequate forage to continue growing, it would decline to maybe 6-7% protein. But of course, the high there in May in well-fertilized Bermuda grass is probably going to be in the 20+% range. And so dramatically different. The take-home message there, I think, is just for producers to understand that. And they may have different species like I'm talking about here in Oklahoma. And those two scenarios might be quite a bit different in terms of, the nutrient needs and appropriate supplementation program for their cattle.
Mm-hmm. Where we're seeing the protein start to wane a bit in these grasses, getting access to that information, or knowing how to find, where do we find that information to what is that grass actually out there? And I know for the most part, somewhat preaching to the choir on this, but just in case for folks that maybe have never done that before, ways in getting or understanding or knowing what is actually out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, surprisingly, there are not very many really good published data sets for people to access that track that seasonal change under different management scenarios. That's one thing we've struggled with here in Oklahoma. Is surprising. That doesn't seem like a very complicated question, but a really important one. And so we've kind of struggled with that. Now we've gathered up some short-term 60 to 120 day projects where people have sampled their forages and so on and documented that. And we use those in our tabular values, and try to describe the situation in the publications we produce through extension, like our nutritive value of forages publication, and we have a software program that has a feed list in it, and it declares nutrient concentration in the different seasons of the year for the different forage types. I wouldn't say it's thorough, but at least it's a place to start for many people. And those kind of resources everybody would have generally in their state. On the other hand, I would say that Justin, compared to, let's say, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, it's a lot easier today to develop your own customized database for your operation. It's just far easier and less expensive than it used to be. And so if you're really serious about knowing and tracking that kind of information, wow, it can be done. And without some of the feed companies, a lot of the mineral formulation companies are offering that service, and their representative will come out and sample your forage for you. And, just doing that once a year or something is probably not going to be terribly helpful. But if you keep at it over time, and whether you do it spring, summer, winter, and fall, or if you really get serious about it and do it every month, the longer you do it, the more valuable that data set of yours becomes, and the more informative it becomes. But anyway, the cost of doing that now with NIR, forage analysis, and so on is just a lot less than it used to be.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Dr. Lalman, let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to talk maybe a little bit more about gathering that information up. I just got a couple quick thoughts I want to hit on. And then beyond that, the next part of our conversation is going to lead us into, okay, so we've identified the need that we may be needing to look at this, but then how do we really nut that down into finding out exactly what we want that to look like, what these animals are needing? Because we got people running everything from yearlings out there to growing heifers, first calf heifers, to running age cows. So kind of step back and look at that. So that'll be the next part of our conversation as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Agrocarbon works with farmers and ranchers to implement practices that promote soil health and add a new revenue stream. Now, when you work with Agrocarbon, you'll gain a partner that provides flexible payments and local agronomic expertise for your row crop or your range or even your pasture operations. Partnering with Agrocarbon is an investment in your land and your ranch's future. Get started today at agrocarbon.com.
All right, Dr. Lalman, you had mentioned in the last segment there about knowing, we don't have a lot of great data sets out there as far as that everybody has for understanding, forage quality, and it could be degrading throughout the year. If you want to do it yourself, that's going to be very valuable information. What it made me think about, though, too, is the fact that if we just find some information, each state, whether it's your land-grant college, probably has an beef extension agent that you can work with to get some data to start with. One of the things that I found valuable in that is just, it may not be dead on accurate, but it's going to at least help you understand that when you start to see a degradation in protein quality in your livestock, if you run those numbers even on what they have, it'll start to give you an idea of, okay, this is what I'm lacking, and this is why or why not. Maybe in certain times of the year, we should be looking at, do we add protein? Do we not? When should we? What's the economics on it? And start to formulate that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And like you say, even though you might not have a real, call it a granular data set that represents your own operation and this year's conditions, that data set that is available in general, maybe tabular publications or whatever, would be a great place to start and let you see the overall trends, seasonal trends. And the other thing that brought to mind your question there, Justin, is that's especially true with the wild west of mineral supplementation. Okay. So if you're able to do that and request when you're working with maybe a professional that does that routinely, request the trace minerals, over time, you'll begin to have a much clearer picture of what your cattle need to be supplemented from a mineral standpoint. So it, obviously goes beyond just protein supplementation.
Yeah, you had a good point there. And just to kind of re-hit that again for folks, if they didn't catch it in the last segment, the mineral companies are very able to help you with that. So use them. I mean, they're out there. Absolutely. So utilize their resources because they do want to help you on that. So this kind of leads us into our next part of our conversation here, as you and I were prefacing before we started talking here today. And really, as a rancher, every ranch has their own enterprises that they're doing. Maybe you're just strictly cow-calf. Maybe you got a yearling side. Maybe you got some growing heifers. All those kinds of different enterprises that are part of a ranch's makeup and everything that they have. So with that in mind, then that brings us to this next step of identifying what are our goals and objectives with the type of enterprises that we have, because each one's going to be a little bit different. If you've got a bunch of yearling steers, you're definitely trying to get a lot of growth on them. If you've got growing heifers, everything's got to be different versus running age cows. So let's talk about that topic that needs to be looked at as you look at this.
Yeah, absolutely. So this concept was first developed, I'm going to say, I might be off a year or two here, but in the 80s by the faculty here at Oklahoma State, the concept for mid to late summer protein supplementation became an obvious need and opportunity for the cattle industry. And so the faculty members that were here then developed what they called or named the Oklahoma Gold and Super Gold program. Well, it was primarily designed to help stocker cattle producers, or in other words, yearling cattle, continue to gain 2 pounds a day or close to it into the middle part and late part of the summer. And that program, we have a lot of data on that program, and it works very well. If you don't provide a little bit of protein supplement, Justin, once the forage protein quality or concentration drops below the animal's requirements, they might gain 1.5 pounds, 1.4 pounds a day. But if you have abundant forage availability and you provide about 1 pound of a high protein, high quality supplement, they'll continue to gain 1.9 to 2 pounds a day. And that program showed that very clearly. Now, I had a call 2 days ago by one of our very good larger cow-calf operations. He said, I've got some sets of females, both spring and fall calving, that we intend to market sometime in November or December this year. I want to keep them in good condition, looking good, shiny, slick hair coat, so on, so that they sell good. So his objective is a little bit different with that set of cows. He's not just trying to maintain a 5, 5.5, maybe a 6 body condition score. He's trying to at least gain get them into a 6 and keep them there. And so we talked about mid to late summer protein supplementation. In his case, as forage quality and maybe quantity declines, he's going to need to feed a little bit more than 1 pound or 2 pounds of a supplement to achieve that objective.
So let's kind of maybe work through some of these different classes of cattle. Could we? And I don't know if you've got this information maybe at your fingertips. I mean, probably to some extent you do, but let's work through some of these different classes. Let's start with maybe just a running age commercial cow, that we're just out there running. We planning on, for the most part, we planning on running her for another year or two, but start there and then work through some of these different classes, everything from starting there down to our maybe our younger cows and into some of these stockers and replacement heifers, things like that, and their protein requirements that they're needing. Because I think to identify that, then we can say, okay, we've tested our forage, or here's where our number's starting at. When, at what point do we start looking at adding that supplementation in there? And I think that's going to start with maybe first identifying what's the protein requirements needed for those classes of cattle.
Yeah, so a lactating cow, mature cow, I'd say most of the industry would have cattle that might peak milk production at somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 pounds a day. Of course, there'll be quite a bit of variability within each herd, but if that's the average, then their dietary protein requirement in mid lactation there in the middle of the summer is still going to be somewhere in that 9 to 11% range. A steer gaining 2 pounds a day is going to need about 11% protein, total dietary concentration. And so, like I mentioned earlier, when our tall grass prairie forage drops to say 6 or 7% by August, those steers are limited in their weight gain. They're not going to gain 2 pounds a day in that case, unless they're protein supplement. Those mature cows will actually begin to restrict milk production further because they are protein limited at 6 or 7% forage protein. That's how that might impact that. But anytime you restrict nutrient intake in a cow that is lactating, there's two things going on at the same time. One is the dynamic change in her body condition or her body fat energy storage. The other is her milk yield and milk composition. So if she's protein limited, the protein concentration of her milk is going to go down. The total milk yield is going to decline a little further versus if she were not protein limited. And then she's going to probably begin to, at the same time, begin losing some of that body condition or going backwards. Now, it may not be very rapid. That all depends on how severe the drought is, how limiting the forage is, how heavily it's been grazed, how much leaf material is left, so on and so forth. So lots of factors there. But I would say that would be what I would anticipate. Now, the question is it economical to go ahead on these mature cows and supplement, let's say, just 1 pound a day, and you could feed that every 3 days. Justin, you don't have to feed it every day. This research that's been conducted there shows very clearly that it's effective if you provide that plant-based protein source. But is it economical? And with high cattle prices like we have now, I would say the answer to that is probably yes. Especially for the 2-year-olds, for the young females that you'd like to keep in better body condition just so they don't go into the fall and winter, in a 4.5 or even a 5. You'd rather those cows maintain a little better body composition. I've carried on here too long, Justin, but to me, it's another nerdy nutrition person thing, but it is fascinating in a lactating cow, whether it's a 2-year-old or a mature cow. These cows are pretty resilient. They are designed to reduce production so that they can maintain a healthy pregnancy, is what it boils down to. So they will reduce their milk production instead of just all out maximizing milk yield, and then which would also wind up maximizing the rate of condition loss.
Yeah.
So two things are going on there at the same time, and it's dynamic.
It is. And that's a good understanding, I think, for a lot of us. I don't know that I'd really thought about it from that perspective, that their first goal as a cow is to maintain that pregnancy. So that does put into perspective why we do see things then get pushed off to second and third in their priority of body management. So, all right, let's take a break here. And when we come back, I want to maybe talk a little bit more about some of the economics of things with that. I think there's a discussion of how much do we want to maintain these cows, because there's a balance in all of that. And of course, it also comes into mind where the market's at as well. So let's continue that conversation when we come back.
A high-functioning rumen drives herd performance, gut health, and profitability. Levucel SC by Lalman Animal Nutrition is the only natural occurring rumen-specific active dry yeast probiotic selected to optimize rumen function, boost fiber digestion, and help you get more out of your forage and feed. No matter how you supplement your herd, including Levucel SC can help your cows do more on what they already have. Discover the right formulation for your herd at chooselevucelsc.com.
Dr. David Lalman is my guest here today on our program today. He is a professor out of Oklahoma State University. And Dr. Lalman, you talking about in the last segment, we were getting down to the discussion of the economics of that. And definitely there's a lot of different things that come into making that decision when we start looking at protein supplementation of cattle in the latter part of the summer or for those in drought type situations. There's definitely a double-edged sword in some of that because you can put a lot of input into these. You can try to keep this cow milking and, do the most with that. But the more she milks, the more she eats as well. So there's kind of some elements of that to keep that in some balance in light of where the market's at as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is for sure. And as we mentioned, I think it's probably more important to optimize their nutrient intake on those younger females. The other thing to consider, I guess we haven't mentioned up to this point, is that as those calves age, they actually consume more forage as a percent of their diet. And so, that's another benefit of a protein supplementation program to those calves is they're probably learning to eat with their mothers. Mm-hmm. That supplement. And then again, when you go to wean those calves, they kind of know what feed is. They might not have been treated out of a feed bunk, but at least they know what feed is. But also that would help maintain their growth rate. Now they're, obviously they're not going to consume very much of that feed, but a little bit. And so you'd kind of get that dual benefit there.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lalman, when we start talking the economics of this, and for probably most of those in ranching, you revert back to several years ago when prices weren't what they are here today. And so when you really look from that perspective, you start to really analyze at what point do you and what point do you not, or that's just all part of the decision-making process. But if we bring into where we're currently at, and we're seeing, we had Bailey Blue on a few weeks ago talking about the Corn Belt Classic that Superior had, and we're just seeing these prices significantly higher across the board on all classes of livestock. So from that perspective, and to put it into current terms, where do we put the economics into this to look at this? I mean, because you're going to pretty much say that if we can get an extra pound of gain or any pound of gain, there's going to be some value in that. But what do you, as kind of a consultant standpoint, if we're having this conversation, what do we look at? What do we need to be cautious about when we start looking at supplementation?
So my perspective on that question, Justin, would maybe go back to your long-term goals and objectives, because this situation we're in now is not going to last forever. And so there will be a day when corn is $7 or $8 a bushel again, and all of the other feeds that we deal with in the cattle industry are substantially more expensive. We still have the cheapest corn we've had since about 2020 at this point in time. And so all of the feeds available to us are very reasonable in the face of historical cattle prices. And that I don't remember that having happened in my career up until this point. But anyway, so let's just take an example. Let's start with a yearling steer. He's out grazing in, we'll just say Oklahoma or Kansas, Flint Hills, tallgrass prairie. That forage is declining rapidly already now here in July, maybe down to the 7-8% range. That steer needs about 11% of his diet as crude protein. If we supply 1 pound a day of, let's say, a 38 or 40%, which would be primarily in this part of the world would be cottonseed meal, a little bit of wheat midds maybe, and or perhaps a bit of dried distillers grains. That might cost around $400 a ton. If you include an ionophore in there and a trace mineral package, 20 cents a pound. If we feed a pound of that per day, we can interval feed it. So you could feed whatever that winds up being. I haven't calculated it lately, but seven days divided by 3 feedings, that would wind up costing you about 20 cents. And then the literature clearly shows that the benefit you get from that is somewhere around half a pound a day increased performance to up to 0.6 of a pound a day increased performance. So you've spent 20 cents if you don't include your delivery costs, Justin, 20 cents to get 6/10 of gain in the cattle. Now, the value of added gain, that's a whole nother discussion, but it's not, the value isn't just cattle price, it's the value of the added weight gain. And so it's usually something less than the cattle price. And lately that has been somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.50 to $2.50. When the cattle prices are escalating like they have been here recently, it's usually at the higher end of that. So we're spending 20 cents and we're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.20, give or take, value. So tremendous return on investment there. And so if your forage is limited, like it might be in your part of the world, you have declining forage quality and forage availability, you probably would want to feed more. So maybe, let's say we call it the Oklahoma Super Gold program here, that's 2.5 pounds a day equivalent instead of 1 pound a day equivalent. It's a 20 to 25% protein product rather than a 38 to 40% protein product. It also includes a vitamin mineral package. It includes an ionophore such as Bovatec or Rumensin. The average daily gain increase on a heifer or a steer through this time of year on that product in a tallgrass prairie grazing situation has been somewhere around 0.7 to 0.75 pounds increase. And that's going to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of about 38 cents per head per day. And so you're right. The economics of taking better care of your cattle in those situations are tremendous right now. My perspective on when do you apply that or not, when do you let that cow demonstrate to you that she can maintain her body condition and get rebred, raise a healthy calf and so on without any inputs, meaning you're not pampering her. Some people might look at it as pampering her through the late part of the summer, would be, well, what is your long-term objective? If you're concerned about that, if that is part of your breeding objective to make sure that those cows are a really good fit for your environment, you probably don't want to implement a strategy like this unless it's an emergency situation like we're talking about with a severe drought.
Yeah. All right. There was two things that came to mind as you were answering that question and some very good numbers to go off. And you nailed exactly what I was wanting you to do. And the two questions I have are actually, they kind of address two different conversations just entirely. But I want to go back to first, let's talk about the protein part of it. And as we talk about the regional components to this conversation, there's folks that are way closer to what I'm going to call the feed, meaning maybe higher protein sources, than folks that aren't. For example, those of us in the western part of the country, it's a long ways to the Corn Belt. And so we don't have the cottonseed, we don't have the distillers or some of those kinds of things as
soybean meal.
Yeah, soybean meal, all of that kind of stuff, easily accessible. So then we start reverting to probably some sort of maybe a block of some sort or something like that. But again, you work through the economics, the numbers of that, there's probably still some value to putting on the gain in even that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other products, convenience products available that are more cost effective in your part of the world because of the, the freight issue and so on. And those are still effective. There hasn't been as much work done with those type of products. Generally speaking, you would probably considering delivering a smaller amount of supplement. So maybe the pound a day or half a pound a day. In some cases, I know there's the mineral product that has a biuret type additive in it, and those cattle can consume maybe a quarter to half a pound a day and still get a nitrogen source to keep that rumen from becoming, nitrogen deficient and limiting the microbial population's activity, which is really what we're after.
Yeah.
And so my take on that is, Justin, those products are effective. You will get an increase in performance, especially in those growing cattle this time of year out there, and as well as the mature cows. The narrower the protein gap between the animal's requirement and the forage supply, the better those non-protein products work. The wider the gap, so say we have a 6% forage protein concentration compared to an animal's 11% requirement, that's a pretty wide gap.
Yeah.
And so that's where you would want to have some sort of a system where you could hopefully supply some plant-based protein to extend the nitrogen delivery longer throughout the day. And then the other side of that, I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but most of those, quote, convenience products, the blocks, the liquid feed products, and so on, are available or delivered in a way that the cattle can access them multiple times a day.
Sure.
So they're just out there all the time. You're not just going out there with your truck and a cake feeder and dumping it out once every 3 days. And that does improve the utilization of those products and increases the performance of those cattle. We've recently looked at utilizing the liquid feed product year round. And the really nice thing about putting a block out, and I understand, I'll have a lot of my colleagues tell me, look, you're pushing something that those products on a cost per unit of crude protein are very expensive. But we could spend an hour on this topic. But like you said, we have all-time high cattle prices. Providing those products late summer, yes, it is going to increase the animal's performance. And the cost per pound is probably not nearly as important as optimizing the cow's body condition and those calves' weaning weight relative to your bottom line. What we found is that our calf weaning weights went up. Why? Because they had a source of ruminal nitrogen, i.e. protein, mid to late summer when that forage quality was declining. And those calves stood around those liquid feeders and just had a heyday. And yeah, it increased our weaning weight substantially.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one more segment, and when we come back, I want to, right off the bat, I want to address folks that consider themselves to be low-input operators and looking at this conversation saying, well, I don't need to mess with that. I want to push back on those folks just a little bit because I consider myself a low-input, but based upon our conversation here today and some other things that I've had, it makes me kind of reevaluate some of this, and so I want to talk about that and just kind of bounce that off of you if I can.
That'll be fun.
You know, your pasture is under attack. Yeah, horn flies. They're wreaking havoc on your herd, dealing damage to your cattle's weight, and in turn, that does affect your bottom line. That's why you need a solution in your arsenal that can withstand an attack. Alticid IGR is the first and proven feed-through that is battle-tested as an effective hornfly management product, delivering the defense needed to keep your herd productive and your profit strong. Win the battle for your cattle. Learn more at AlticidIGR.com.
All right, Dr. Lalman, as we start to wrap up our conversation, and I told you I wanted to bounce something off of you on this for those that consider themselves to be low-input operators and think that, well, we don't really need to put anything out there because we don't want less input means, you know, we're going to make more profit at the end of the year is the concept in this. And I want to push back a little bit because I think if we're really going to be business people in our ranching operations, we got to look at net profit at the end of the day in all of this. And when we were having our conversation in the last segment, you were working through some of these numbers. And let's get away from the pride factor that some people want to claim to be or whatever when they talk about their input costs. And from a pure business perspective, there is some value, especially where the market's at now. Maybe not always, but right now, if we can put a pound of gain in at a reasonable price that makes sense, and then you even said beyond that, maybe you break even on that just to maintain the condition on your cow as you go into wintertime. I'm going to push back and say from a low input standpoint, it's not about low input, it's about net gain and net profit at the end of this. And there's some value to be putting some protein into these cattle this year, isn't there?
Yeah, for sure, especially in the growing animals. We talked about the breeding objectives and whether that is, as you say, if that is a primary objective to some breeders. I get it. I understand. But you don't need to do that 365 days a year. Mm-hmm. And you can also, perhaps in the post-weaning period, it makes the most sense to me to take advantage of some of these technologies to optimize your net income, and especially on these growing cattle.
Yeah. Well, and I think for myself, I look at this and I've just always analyzed this and think, well, you know, I'm just not going to spend the money. And from a business perspective, and I'm going to take just ranching out. If you were just any business, if you can put in $1 and get $3 back, that's a good investment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe, depending on the breeding objective, if you could prioritize those objectives across the stages of production. So heifers, maybe steers that you've held over to graze through the summer versus your 2-year-olds. And so let me explain that just a little bit further. If you've challenged your heifers to match your forage resources on your operation, and you're a low input producer, maybe you've developed those heifers to be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 55% of their expected mature body weight. You've challenged them up to that point. If you started the breeding season and that's all they weighed, okay, so you've already challenged them at that point, and then you subject them to a 30-day breeding season. Now you're trying to keep the heifers that have shown you that they can handle it. They can handle that low input system.
Mm-hmm.
From that point on, it makes no sense to me to lose 30, 40, 50% of those females that don't breed back as a 2-year-old because you continue to challenge. If there's ever a time to take advantage of some of this technology, the concepts we've talked about here today, it's that group of cattle, right? We need to take good care of those 2-year-olds. And then later on, once they become a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and so on, they can go right back to that low input philosophy and system we talked about earlier. In our case here at Oklahoma State, in our research program, sometimes we are forced to maintain our 2-year-olds with our mature cows. And let me tell you, when we have to do that, when we have to treat them like the mature cows, they still fall apart. They do not fare very well. Now, maybe that's because I'm poor in terms of my genetic selection. Maybe I haven't done a great job. But it makes no sense to me not to pull those 2-year-olds off, treat them differently, find better quality forage, and definitely have an optimal supplementation program in mind for them. I mean, for crying out loud, as we've already talked about, it's just not going to cost that much in the situation we're in right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you address some things there that you're going to have folks listening, I'm sure, that are going to say, well, okay, maybe your genetics aren't there, or maybe you're, like you had said, pampering them a little bit too much. But I think that beyond that, these cattle in a drought environment where, as I said earlier, 75% of the country is experiencing some element of that, there's some stress on these livestock. And it's those young cows that it's not like we got to go over the top and make them too fat, but to take care of them a little bit, I think there's some value in there, because not every year is the same. Next year, there's a pretty good chance some of the folks that are in drought are going to have a better year, and those cows are going to be just fine.
You know what? You're going to get me going here, but an interesting thing to think about is that someone that doesn't purchase, let's say, a low input system, and they do not spend much money on external inputs, so they rely primarily on a grazing system. I think many times what you'll find is they have a lower stocking rate. Okay, and maybe haven't thought about it that way. But if you have a lower stocking rate, what you have done, you might consider they've artificially modified the environment, just like somebody that's feeding additional or extra supplement, because you're allowing those cattle to select a better quality forage. And so just to say that you're low input because you're not purchasing as much technology or feed or whatever, I get it. And that's important, no doubt about it. In tough times, in other words, high input prices, we need to be thinking about that and optimizing our opportunity for income there. But yeah, you can artificially modify the environment just by lowering your stocking rate. It's incredible to go back and look at the literature and see if animals have abundant quality leafy material available, even though it may be late summer or early fall, they can select dramatically higher quality diet if it's abundant and available like that compared to pasture that's been picked over. It maybe is a little more complicated than we like to assume.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Lalman, a good discussion. I think a lot of numbers and things for all of us to think about, especially if you're in the tractor and you're doing summer work, or you're in the pickup going back and forth, especially in these hot days when you're maybe can be inside a little bit, need to kind of reevaluate and work some of your numbers, especially as we start looking ahead and knowing that in areas that is droughted out a little bit, where we anticipate hay prices to probably be a little bit higher. And I think that's another aspect that we got to think about as we're looking through some of this as well.
Yeah, fortunately, we've had a pretty good year here so far in Oklahoma. Now, western Oklahoma, not so much, central and east of here. And so hopefully those hay prices, at least to 100 to 200 miles west of us, Justin, are still going to be reasonable. But yeah, I feel for you all out that far, and hopefully that situation will improve a little bit. The other thing I just thought of, we didn't talk too much about, maybe you're all people out in your part of the world would have more availability to the dried distiller's grain product. Might not be as far away. And boy, in almost every situation we have tested that product, Justin, it is a good quality, more undegradable, in other words, slower degradable protein source for cattle. So when we're talking about this subject, that product fits in really well.
Yeah. Yep. We do see a little more accessibility to it, a little bit closer than some of the other things, but for sure, good comment there. All right, before we go, just one quick question. It actually has really not a lot to do with what we talked about today, but I do like to ask folks that come on here, any recommended book, either for professional development that you would recommend to ranchers, or a podcast you listen to that you'd recommend, just something out there for folks to give them some help with whatever, whether it's on what we talked about here today or just professional improvement as a rancher?
Well, you asked me that. It just came to my mind. One of my favorite books is, and I don't remember the exact title, but it's The Bell Ranch in New Mexico. Have you read that one?
No, I have not. Huh?
So, technology, it originally was a land grant, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of acres in New Mexico, and it is fascinating. Technology was Hereford cattle. Technology was windmills, developing water, and it's just a really fun read to see how those folks made the ranching system work back then. Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Was it called Bell Ranch Cattle Ranching in the Southwest? Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's got to be it.
Yeah, 1824 to 1947. So
yes,
yeah. All right.
It goes through about 4 managers of that program, and they all had their strengths and just really fun history.
All right. Well, Dr. Lalman, good to have you here today on the program. Appreciate the information and a great visit with you.
It's been my pleasure and had a fun visit. Thank you.
You bet. And again, our guest joining us here on the program, Dr. Dave Lalman, professor at Oklahoma State University. Well, stay with us. Coming up next, meteorologist Don Day is in as we take a look at our long-range weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY, that's RAINDAY, for free shipping and 10%.
Today's long-range weather brought to you by long-range cattle dewormer with epinomectin. With 150 days of parasite protection in just one single dose, you can keep your herd grazing, gaining weight without the extra parasite pressure. To find out more, you can check out their website at longrangedewormer.com. Well, joining us now with a look at our long-range weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, for a lot of part of the country, it's been a pretty extensive heat that we've seen here. And as we start to go through this heat, you'd mentioned, and I know some of your podcasts, that we need to do this in order to get to the next component of our weather, which is hopefully a lot more precipitation across many portions that have seen dryness. So what do you anticipate as we're going through this heat and what it's going to lead to after that?
Well, it's a really interesting weather pattern because we have this very large and very dominant high pressure ridge that's setting up over the central United States. And for July, you expect this. I mean, this is actually the time of year when we tend to see a robust high set up in the middle of the United States. And what we tend to see is it kind of move around a bit. It might be for a week in the northern plains and the Corn Belt, and then it might shift down into the southern plains, might shift west back to the Rockies and east to the southeastern United States. So that's not unusual, but we really haven't had a central U.S. high plains high, even in the month of June, that lasted very long. So this is kind of a game changer in terms of getting us into a more mature summer pattern, which is what you need to, at least for parts of the western United States, to get wet again. And this is especially true for the desert Southwest and the southern and the central Rockies, and most notably the areas west of the Continental Divide that are suffering through fire activity and very droughty conditions. This would be western Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and then into portions of Wyoming, and then the adjacent high plains still in very much drought conditions. The high in the middle of the country helps draw that moisture out of the subtropics and bring it into the western United States far enough north to mean something. And we just haven't had that. We didn't see that all in the month of June and even up through the 4th of July. So that's a dynamic that's changing. Now, while things will change for the better out west, the middle of the country is really going to suffer through a prolonged spell of heat, and there will be some pockets of dryness underneath this high pressure ridge that we'll need to keep an eye on.
So with that in mind, I guess that what brings to mind then is kind of that Corn Belt area that's going to be pretty hot and not much moisture. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, I am concerned about some really dry areas developing in parts of the western Corn Belt. As the high kind of migrates and moves around a little bit, that will cause the dryness to be in one area for a while, then move into another location. But the western Corn Belt, part of the southern plains, underneath this high will have a hard time getting showers and thunderstorms going. So this will mean portions of eastern and central Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, into maybe eastern Nebraska and parts of that northwest Corn Belt that extends into southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. One thing that happens though in these very large high pressure ridge, or like some people like to call them heat domes, is you get what's called the ring of fire. You get moisture that circulates around the high pressure that does cause showers and thunderstorms to develop along the periphery. So on the edges of the ridge, you do have some chances for rain, but if you're right under it, and that's where we need to watch, that's where the dry areas will develop. And right now, those states I mentioned in the next week or two are the areas I'm most concerned about.
Okay, so and finally, one question here. You'd referred to in late spring that it was taking a long time for this monsoon to happen. So now that we start to see it happening, is it going to be a short, long, or medium, or do you have any indication of what that's going to lead to?
Well, indications is that it's going to be here for a while, but keep in mind, monsoonal moisture flows, or what we call the monsoon, North American monsoon, isn't a continuous feed of moisture. It kind of comes in surges, so you have gaps. But it looks like for the rest of July, deep into August, we should see this same pattern. So that's why there's some encouragement for west of the Continental Divide and those very dry areas to finally get into precipitation. But it's always a trade-off, because with that better weather in the west, the trade-off is drier weather in the central part of the country. So this could be a rather persistent pattern that goes for several weeks.
All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update, and we'll check in with you next week.
Sounds good.
You bet. And again, that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. If you want to tune in each and every day to his daily video podcast, you can find it by going to his website at dayweather.com. Well, if you're in the livestock business, no doubt you're probably in the water monitoring business as well, especially when it's as hot as it has been, is looking like it's going to be, but really year-round when it comes to that. And you can do what we've been doing here on our places for the last couple of years. We use a water monitoring system from Tank Toad. It works great whether it's solar or satellite, depending on the location that you're at, but we can keep an eye on the levels in our cistern tanks. In fact, we even have one of them tied into a well controller. So when the cistern tank draws down, it can kick that tank that well on. Extremely handy, saves us a lot of time of back and forth and monitoring those things. So check it out for yourself. You can go to tanktoad.com and tell them you heard it here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Before we leave here today, I want to remind you that the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you have to step away from the radio for some reason here today, you can always catch all of our shows by going to our podcast site at workingranchrradio.com or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can do it there as well. And be sure to leave us a ratings or a review. That is much appreciated. Well, we do thank you for joining us here on the program today. Again, if you'd like to get a hold of me, you can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Justin Mills. And until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.